Western Virginia, January 1871. The wind that moved through the Allegheny Highlands that winter was not the kind you described to someone who hadn't felt it. It came off the ridgeline in long, low walls. Not gusts, but sustained pressure, the kind that found every gap in a log wall, every loose corner of a hide curtain, every poorly chinked seam between timber and mud. Settlers who had survived one winter in those mountains understood something that no almanac printed. The cold didn't just fall from the sky. It rose from the ground, climbed the walls, and settled in the corners where children slept. Most people who traveled the old Staunton Road in that stretch of Western Virginia noticed the cave opening on the north-facing limestone ridge only because it was odd. A dark mouth in the rock, maybe 8 feet wide and 6 feet tall at the arch, half hidden by a curtain of dried sedge grass and what appeared to be a carefully fitted frame of river-smooth stones. From the road, it looked like a root cellar someone had abandoned, maybe a storage cut for salted meat. Nothing worth stopping for. But in the winter of 1871, something was happening inside that cave that local accounts would later struggle to explain. While families in proper log cabins along the valley floor burned through their wood piles week after week, stacking cord upon cord of split oak and hickory against the cold and still waking to frost on the inside of their walls, the woman who lived in that cave opening was burning less than half of what her neighbors used. And her children, by every account that survived the period, never once woke up shivering. Nobody wrote about it at the time. There were no newspapers covering the North Ridge. No county surveyor made note of it. What we know comes from letters from the handwritten journal of a circuit preacher who passed through in March of 1872, and from the kind of oral record that traveled slowly, the way useful things always do, through trading posts and churchyards, and the quiet conversations of women comparing how they had managed the season. What she built was not magic. It was not luck. It was engineering, old, patient, and precise, born entirely from necessity and carried out with materials that cost her nothing but labor. This is her story, and once you understand what she actually did inside that cave, you will never look at a stone wall the same way again. If you've ever wondered how people survived brutal winters before central heating, before insulation bats and double pane glass, this channel is exactly where you need to be. Subscribe right now, because every week we go back to the techniques that kept real people alive in real conditions. Hit that like button, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, and stay with us, because what happens in Chapter 5 of this story genuinely rewrote what the Valley believed about heat. Her name was Cora Aldine. She had come to the North Ridge not by choice, but by circumstance. The particular kind of circumstance that the 1870s dealt to women who found themselves alone with children and a parcel of land that produced more rock than grain. Her husband, a quarry worker named Burl Aldine, had died in the autumn of 1869 from a chest sickness that spread through the camp where he worked. He left Cora with 2 children, a girl of 7 named Retta and a boy of 5 named Silas, a mule that was older than either of them, a half-built log structure that leaked in 3 places, and approximately 4 acres of hill slope that nobody in the county had ever successfully farmed. She was 31 years old. The first winter after Burl's death, Cora had managed by burning everything she could split and by accepting, with quiet dignity, 2 deliveries of wood from a neighboring family named Pruitt who lived 2 ridges south. She had not asked for the wood. It had simply appeared on her property line, split and stacked, without note or expectation of repayment. She had accepted it because her children were cold, but she had also decided sometime in the weeks that followed that she would not need it a second time. The problem was specific. The log structure Burl had started was salvageable. She had chinked it through the summer of 1870 with a mixture of clay, dry grass, and wood ash, but it sat on poor ground. The floor was bare earth, and in January the cold rose through it the way cold always rises through bare earth, slowly, invisibly, and completely. By February, the temperature inside rarely climbed above 38 degrees Fahrenheit, 3 degrees Celsius, even with a fire burning. She had tried raising a plank floor. The planks warped, and the air beneath them became a refrigerated channel that made things worse. She burned wood faster than she could split it. The woodpile shrank at a rate that frightened her. The cave had been there all along, 40 yards up the ridge behind the cabin. She had used it to store root vegetables through the previous winter, turnips, dried beans, the remnants of a small potato harvest, because the cave's natural temperature, a relatively stable 50 to 54 degrees Fahrenheit, 10 to 12 degrees Celsius, kept stored food from both freezing and rotting. She knew the cave held temperature. She had felt it herself every time she ducked inside to retrieve something. The question she began asking herself in the spring of 1871 was not dramatic. It was practical, almost domestic in its simplicity. If the cave stays warmer than the outside air on its own, what happens if I add a fire? She didn't know the term thermal mass. She had never read about radiant heat storage or convective flow dynamics. But she understood stone. She had grown up in a house with a stone foundation in the Shenandoah Valley. She knew that a hearthstone, properly placed, held warmth long after a fire had gone to ash. She knew that a stone wall in August stayed cool at noon and warm at midnight. She understood, in the practical and embodied way that people understand things they have lived with all their lives, that stone remembered heat. And she had an entire cave made of it. Cora began in late April of 1871, when the ground had thawed enough to move and the days were long enough to give her working light after her morning chores were done. She did not draw plans. She worked from a logic that was architectural in everything but name. The cave itself was a natural limestone formation, what geologists call a solution cave, carved over thousands of years by slightly acidic groundwater dissolving the rock. It ran approximately 28 feet, 8.5 meters, deep from the entrance, widening to about 14 feet, 3 meters, across at its broadest point, with a ceiling that averaged 7 feet, 2.1 meters, in height. The floor was uneven but relatively flat in the interior section. The walls were solid. The rock was dry. Her first task was the floor. She spent the better part of 3 weeks hauling flat sandstone slab from a dry creek bed a quarter-mile east of the ridge. Sandstone specifically, because it splits into manageable layers and holds heat well, without cracking under thermal stress the way some limestones will. She laid these slabs directly on the cave floor, dry-fitted, tight-joined, working from the back of the cave toward the entrance. Retta helped carry the smaller pieces. Silas was assigned to keep the mule from wandering. The finished floor covered roughly 220 square feet, 20 square meters, of livable cave space, enough for sleeping, cooking, and working. The firebox came next, and this was the decision that defined everything else. She did not place the fire at the entrance, the way most temporary cave camps did, where draft was easy and smoke escaped readily, but heat was immediately lost to the open air. She placed the firebox at the rear of the cave, approximately 22 feet, 6.7 meters, from the entrance. She built it low and compact, a 3-sided enclosure of dry-stacked limestone blocks, roughly 18 inches, 46 centimeters, tall and 24 inches, 61 centimeters, wide, with a shallow ash pit beneath a raised iron grate salvage from her old cabin's ruined stove. The firebox sat against the solid back wall of the cave, using the cave's own rock as the fourth wall of the combustion chamber. The chimney, and this is the part that stopped people cold when they finally understood it, was not a chimney in the traditional sense. She chiseled a narrow angled channel, roughly 6 inches, 15 centimeters, wide, into a natural crack that already existed in the upper rear wall of the cave. The crack ran at a slight upward angle for approximately 11 feet, 3.4 meters, before opening to the exterior on the upper face of the ridge, well above the cave mouth. The draft this created was slow and consistent, not the roaring draw of a tall vertical chimney, but a steady, low pull that kept smoke moving without pulling heated air out of the cave too rapidly. The entrance was the final element, and perhaps the most quietly brilliant. She built a double wall at the cave mouth. The outer wall was stacked fieldstone, rough, uncut river rock mortared with clay, rising to 5 feet, 1.5 meters, and leaving a gap of approximately 16 inches, 40 centimeters, between itself and an inner wall of the same construction. This gap, this dead air space between two stone walls, functioned as a thermal buffer. Outside cold had to pass through the mass of the outer wall, then cross that still air gap, then pass through the mass of the inner wall before it could enter the living space. Between the inner wall and the cave interior, a heavy double-layered elk hide curtain hung on a wooden rod, adding a final seal. The total thermal barrier at the entrance was, by rough estimate, the equivalent of a wall with an insulating capacity far beyond anything a single-layer log wall could achieve. In the language of modern building science, what Cora Aldine built was a passively heated thermal mass shelter with a rear-positioned radiant heat source, a low-velocity exhaust system, an insulating air gap at the primary cold entry point, and a stone floor capable of storing and re-radiating heat for hours after combustion stopped. She called it the cave house. Her daughter Retta called it the warm place. Her son Silas, who was 5, called it the rock den, and thought it was the finest home he had ever lived in. Nobody came to inspect the cave house with any formality. There was no building committee on the North Ridge of Western Virginia in 1871. What there was, instead, was the kind of slow-moving social commentary that travels between people who are genuinely puzzled by something they don't understand and slightly unsettled by what it might mean if it works. Cora finished the primary construction by mid-July. By August, word had moved, the way word moves in small communities, that the Aldine widow had taken her children to live in the hillside. This was not received as a neutral piece of information. Harlan Grubb, a carpenter who had built 3 of the valley's more substantial log homes, and whose opinion on construction matters was considered final by most of the families within a 5-mile radius, rode up the Staunton Road in early September and paused long enough to look at the cave entrance from his saddle. He did not dismount. He looked at the double stone wall, at the hide curtain, at the uneven rock facade that Cora had built, and he said, according to the journal of the circuit preacher who recorded it secondhand, something to the effect that it looked like a badger's den and would fill with smoke the first time she lit a fire in it, and that he gave it until December before she'd be knocking on somebody's door with her children and a blanket. He was not being cruel. Exactly. He was operating from genuine experience. Every cave camp he'd ever seen had been abandoned because of smoke. Without a proper tall chimney and a correctly positioned firebox, a cave filled with combustion gases the way a bottle fills with water, completely and quickly. He had seen men nearly die from it. His assessment was, by every rule he knew, entirely reasonable. 2 women at the Pruitt trading post, the same family that had delivered Cora wood the previous winter, agreed with Grubb's general conclusion and added their own refinements. One said the stone floor would hold the cold from the earth and make the space colder, not warmer. The other said that without proper timber framing, the entrance walls would collapse under the first hard freeze when the clay mortar contracted. Both of these concerns were not unreasonable given standard construction knowledge of the period. None of them were right, but none of them were entirely wrong either, which is the thing about expertise applied to a problem it has never quite encountered before. Grubb knew traditional chimney science perfectly. The women knew clay mortar behavior perfectly. What none of them knew was what happened when you placed the heat source at the rear of a stone mass 22 feet deep, vented it through a diagonal crack rather than a vertical shaft, and let the entire cave wall system, thousands of pounds of limestone, become the radiator rather than just the enclosure. Cora heard what was being said. She had gone to the trading post herself in late September for salt and lamp oil. She had listened to the careful way people didn't quite say things to her face. She had nodded, paid for her goods, loaded the mule, and gone back up the ridge. She lit the first fire in the cave house on October 3rd, 1871. The smoke moved cleanly up the rear channel and out the ridge face above. The stone walls began, slowly, to warm. The winter of 1871 to 1872 arrived early in Western Virginia, and it arrived without apology. By the second week of November, the temperature along the Allegheny Ridge had already dropped below 20 degrees Fahrenheit minus 6 degrees Celsius on multiple nights. By the last week of November, it had gone below 10 degrees Fahrenheit minus 12 degrees Celsius and stayed there. The ground froze to a depth that snapped fence posts. Springs that had run year-round in living memory slowed to thin trickles and then stopped entirely. The snow came in mid-December and did not leave until March. Local accounts from the period describe it as one of the 4 worst winters in the preceding 3 decades. Families who had built solid, well-chinked log cabins were burning between 1 and 2 cords of wood per week. A cord of wood, 128 cubic feet, approximately 3.6 cubic meters, of split timber, was the standard unit of fuel for the region, and experienced settlers laid in between 12 and 18 cords for a full winter season. Even at that rate, by January, some families were watching their stacks thin faster than expected. The math of a brutal winter is unforgiving. Every extra degree of cold outside means more wood inside, and there is no renegotiating that equation once the season has begun. The Pruitt family, the neighbors who had delivered wood to Cora the previous winter, burned through their first 6 cords by the 1st of January. They were not profligate. They were careful, experienced people who knew how to manage a winter fire. But their cabin, a well-built 16 by 20-foot log structure with a fieldstone chimney, was losing heat through its walls, its floor, and its ceiling continuously, the way all single-envelope structures do. The fire was not heating the room so much as it was fighting the cold to a draw. Cora Aldine, in the cave house on the North Ridge, had burned approximately 2.5 cords of wood by the 1st of January. This is the number that matters. This is the number that, when it finally reached the valley, quietly, through the circuit preacher's journal and through Retta Aldine mentioning it at the trading post without quite understanding how unusual it was, stopped conversations mid-sentence. 2.5 cords. Against 6, in a winter that was actively trying to kill everyone. The explanation is physics, and it is not complicated once you see it. The sandstone floor of the cave house, approximately 220 square feet of it, laid 3 to 4 inches, 7 to 10 centimeters thick, had a combined mass of roughly 3,800 to 4,200 pounds, 1,720 to 1,900 kilograms. Sandstone has a heat capacity of approximately 0.92 kilojoules per kilogram per degree Celsius. When Cora burned a moderate evening fire for 3 to 4 hours, that floor, along with the limestone cave walls that surrounded it, absorbed heat the way a battery absorbs current, slowly, completely, and with a long, steady discharge curve. After the fire died, the stone did not stop being warm. It continued radiating heat back into the space, slowly, at a lower temperature, but continuously, for 6 to 9 hours. A standard log cabin of the period had almost no thermal mass. Its walls were timber, a material with relatively low heat capacity. When the fire in a log cabin went out at midnight, the temperature inside began dropping almost immediately. By 4 in the morning, the room could be 20 to 25 degrees Fahrenheit colder than it had been at 10 o'clock the night before. Families who could afford to woke in the night to feed the fire. Those who couldn't simply endured the cold hours before dawn. In Cora's cave house, the circuit preacher recorded a specific observation in his journal from a visit in late February 1872. He had arrived in the early morning. Before dawn, he noted, because he was traveling between 2 congregations and the North Ridge was on his route. He wrote that the cave house interior was noticeably warmer than the outside air to a degree that required removing one's coat upon entry, and that a fire had not been lit, by the widow's account, since the previous evening at supper. He estimated the interior temperature, by feel and by the comfort of the children he observed sleeping without extra blankets, at somewhere between 52 degrees Fahrenheit and 60 degrees Fahrenheit, 11 to 15 degrees Celsius. Outside, that morning, the temperature was 8 degrees Fahrenheit minus 13 degrees Celsius. The fire had been out for approximately 10 hours. The stone was still warm. Stay with us, because in the next chapters, we're going to show you the exact numbers that made Harlan Grubb go quiet, and how what Cora built on a Virginia ridgeline in 1871 ended up changing the way an entire valley thought about winter. If you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. Every week on this channel, we bring you a technique that real people used when survival wasn't optional. The best ones, like this one, still work today. By the time February of 1872 had settled into the valley with its particular brand of gray, wet cold, the kind that follows a hard January the way a bruise follows a blow, the people who lived along the Staunton Road had begun to take an informal accounting of how the winter was treating them. This was not unusual. Settlers in that region kept track of wood consumption the way merchants kept track of inventory, carefully, constantly, and with a low-grade anxiety that never entirely left until the first week of April. What emerged from those quiet conversations, those comparisons made at the trading post and across fence lines and in the back of church on Sundays, was a picture that nobody had quite prepared for. The Pruitt family had burned 11 cords by mid-February. They were experienced, efficient, and not wasteful. They damped their stove at night. They kept the cabin small and close, and they had sealed their walls the previous autumn with fresh chinking. 11 cords. They estimated they would need another 4 to 5 to see the season out, putting their total somewhere between 15 and 16 cords for the winter. The Cutter family, half a mile north of the Pruitts in a newer cabin with a well-fitted stone chimney, had burned 8.5 cords. They were slightly better insulated than average for the region, and the circuit preacher noted their cabin with approval in his journal. 8.5 cords. A family named Doswell, living in a 2-room cabin at the base of the North Ridge, close enough that they could see the upper face of the ridge where Cora's exhaust vent opened on clear days, had burned 13 cords and were actively worried about running short. Their cabin was older, the chinking had loosened in the east wall, and they had a child who ran cold and needed the interior kept above 55 degrees Fahrenheit, 13 degrees Celsius at all times. 13 cords and counting. Cora Aldine had burned 4.25 cords by mid-February. That number requires a moment to absorb. 4.25 cords measured against 11, 8.5, and 13 in the same winter on the same ridge in the same sustained cold. The Doswell cabin, sitting at the base of the very ridge that Cora's cave was cut into, had burned 3 times as much wood. The Pruitts had burned nearly 3 times as much. Even the well-built Cutter cabin had burned roughly double. The difference was not effort. It was not virtue or luck or some advantage of Cora's position on the ridge. It was geometry and mass. Here is what the stone was doing, stated plainly, in a language that the valley came to use only much later when people with more education tried to explain what Cora had understood by instinct. The limestone walls of the cave, combined with the sandstone floor, represented approximately 18,000 to 22,000 pounds, 8,200 to 10,000 kilograms, of dense, dry stone that had been at a stable 52 degrees Fahrenheit, 11 degrees Celsius, before Cora ever lit the first fire. Every hour that fire burned, the stone absorbed heat through direct radiation from the firebox and through the warm air convecting through the space. The rate of absorption was slow. Stone does not heat quickly, but the rate of discharge was equally slow. Once that mass was warmed, it did not give up its heat the way timber walls did. It held it. It metered it back into the space in long, low waves of radiant warmth that no log cabin of that period could replicate. The cave geometry added another factor that no one had named, but everyone who entered noticed. The cave was roughly cylindrical in cross-section, wider at the base than at the ceiling, and the warmed air had nowhere to escape to. In a standard cabin, warm air rises, hits the ceiling, and begins migrating toward gaps, joints, and imperfections in the structure, of which there are always many. In Cora's cave, the ceiling was solid limestone, the floor was solid sandstone, and the walls were solid stone. The only opening was the entrance, which was buffered by the double wall and the hide curtain. Warm air that rose to the ceiling simply stayed there, gradually equalizing with the rest of the space, losing almost nothing to infiltration. The circuit preacher, a methodical man named Elias Vane who had enough scientific curiosity to make him useful as an observer, recorded 3 temperature measurements inside the cave house during his visits that winter. He used a small mercury thermometer that he carried for weather observation. His readings, December 29, 1871, approximately 2 hours after the evening fire was lit, 71 degrees Fahrenheit, 22 degrees Celsius interior, 14 degrees Fahrenheit minus 10 degrees Celsius exterior. February 3rd, 1872. Early morning, fire unlit since the previous evening. 57 degrees Fahrenheit, 14 degrees Celsius interior, 9 degrees Fahrenheit minus 13 degrees Celsius exterior. February 26th, 1872. Midday, fire burning moderately. 74 degrees Fahrenheit, 23 degrees Celsius interior, 22 degrees Fahrenheit minus 6 degrees Celsius exterior. The gap between interior and exterior temperature on the morning of February 3rd was 48 degrees Fahrenheit, 27 degrees Celsius. The fire had been out for approximately 9 to 10 hours. The stone had held nearly all the heat from the previous evening and was still radiating it into the living space at a rate sufficient to keep 2 children comfortable through the night without additional fuel. Elias Vane wrote, in a sentence that has the particular quality of a man trying to be careful, I cannot account for this by any principle of cabin construction I am familiar with, and I have traveled these mountains for 11 years. The stone appears to behave as a kind of slow furnace, absorbing when fire is present and releasing when fire is not. He had, in a single unschooled sentence, described thermal mass storage with more accuracy than many engineering texts of the period managed. Beyond the firewood consumption and the temperature differentials, several secondary effects emerged from Cora's design that the valley would come to value as much as the heat itself. The firewood she burned dried faster. She had stacked her winter supply in a shallow alcove near the cave entrance, between the outer and inner stone walls, in that 16-inch buffer zone. With a mild warmth from inside and the dry air circulating through the gap drew moisture from the wood continuously. Green or damp wood that might have burned poorly in a standard stove arrived at her firebox preconditioned. Drier, lighter, and more combustible than the same wood sitting in a covered pile outside a neighbor's cabin. Dry wood burns hotter and cleaner than damp wood, requiring less volume to produce the same heat. This created a compounding efficiency. Drier wood burned better, required less of it, which left more stone-stored heat between fires, which meant fewer fires needed, which left more time for wood to dry further. The smoke problem that Harlan Grubb had predicted with such confidence, the cave filling with combustion gases, had not materialized. The diagonal rear vent created what Vane described as a steady but gentle draw that moved smoke efficiently without creating the strong draft that would have pulled heated air out of the space. A tall vertical chimney, by contrast, creates a vigorous draft that is excellent at removing smoke, but equally excellent at removing the warm air you want to keep. Cora's low-angle vent balanced these competing demands in a way that was, from a fluid dynamic standpoint, surprisingly sophisticated for a solution arrived at by observation rather than calculation. The children, Retta and Silas, had not been sick that winter. This was noted by Elias Vane without elaboration, but the implication was clear to anyone who knew what a typical frontier winter did to small children sleeping in drafty cabins on cold floors. The spring of 1872 arrived slowly, the way springs do after hard winters, tentative, then sudden, the snow pulling back from the south-facing slopes first while the north ridges held their white for another 3 weeks. By April, the valley was green enough to remind people that the cold had been a season, not a permanent condition, and the conversations shifted from survival to accounting. Who had managed, who had struggled, and who had done something that didn't quite fit the expected categories. Cora Aldine fit the third category, and the valley was not entirely sure what to do with that. It began with Elias Vane. He was not, by nature, a gossip, but he was a connector, a man who moved between communities and carried information as a kind of professional courtesy. In his spring visits to congregations along the valley, he mentioned the cave house on the North Ridge. He mentioned it carefully, with the qualifications of a man who understood that what he was describing sounded implausible. He showed people his thermometer readings. He mentioned the wood consumption numbers. He let the numbers speak, which was wise, because the numbers were more persuasive than any argument he could have constructed. The first person to visit the cave house after winter broke was a man named Corbett Winslow. a practical-minded farmer from the southern end of the valley who had burned through his entire winter woodpile by March 1st and spent the last 6 weeks of the season burning fence rails and green timber cut in a mild desperation that had left him with a smoky cabin and a strong opinion that something needed to change. He rode up to the North Ridge in early May, hat in hand, and asked Cora if he could look at what she had built. She showed him. She showed him the floor, the firebox placement, the rear vent channel, the double entrance wall. She explained the logic of each element in the plain, functional language of someone describing a tool rather than an invention. Corbett Winslow walked the space twice, ran his hand along the stone walls, crouched to look at the ash pit under the iron grate, and stood at the entrance looking back at the firebox for a long time without saying anything. Then he said, "The fire being at the back, that's the thing, isn't it?" Cora said that it was one of the things. He left and came back 2 weeks later with his son, a young man of 19 named Abel Winslow, who had a facility with stonework. They spent 2 hours in the cave house taking informal measurements. By July of 1872, the Winslow property had a new addition, a stone-lined dugout built into the south-facing bank behind their barn, with a rear-position firebox and a double-wall entrance on Cora's model. It was not a cave. They had no convenient cave, but the principle was the same: maximum stone mass surrounding a small, deep fire. That winter of 1872 to 1873, the Winslows burned 40% less wood than they had the previous year, in a winter of roughly equivalent severity. Corbett Winslow told everyone. The spread of the technique through the valley was organic, which is to say it was uneven, adaptive, and driven entirely by usefulness. Nobody organized it. No county official recommended it. No newspaper article explained it. It moved the way all genuinely useful knowledge moves through communities that depend on practical competence. Person to person, with variations introduced by each new builder based on available materials, terrain, and the specific problems they were trying to solve. By the autumn of 1873, 3 additional families in the valley had incorporated stone mass principles into their winter heating arrangements. None of them replicated Cora's cave house exactly. Few had access to a suitable natural cave, but the underlying logic had transferred: stone positioned behind and beside the heat source, mass between the living space and the cold exterior, fire placed deep rather than near the entrance. By the end of 1874, Elias Vane noted in his journal that he counted, on his regular circuit, 7 structures in the broader region that showed clear influence of what he had by then taken to calling the Aldine principle, though he was careful to note that Cora herself did not use that phrase and would likely have found it awkward. Harlan Grubb, the carpenter who had surveyed the cave house from his saddle and predicted smoke-filled failure, visited the cave house himself in the autumn of 1873. He came, it seems, out of professional conscience, the kind that makes skilled people revisit problems they've already solved when evidence suggests their solution might be incomplete. He spent most of an afternoon there. He did not say much. When he left, he began, in his next commissions, incorporating deeper fireboxes and larger stone hearth surrounds into his cabin designs. He never explicitly credited Cora, but the cabins he built after 1873 were measurably warmer than the ones he had built before. The thing about useful knowledge, when it comes from unexpected sources, is that the community's relationship to its origin is always complicated. People are more comfortable adopting a technique than crediting its inventor, particularly when the inventor doesn't fit the template they have assigned to inventors. Cora Aldine was a widow on a rocky ridge with 2 children and no formal training in anything. She had not reasoned her way to a principle. She had observed her way to one, which is actually how most genuinely important engineering ideas begin, not in academies, but in the specific, desperate, practical thinking of people who need something to work. What she understood in the winter of 1871 was that the mountain itself was offering her something that no timber merchant could sell and no carpenter could build: permanent, massive, dry stone, material that had been absorbing and releasing the slow heat of the earth for 10,000 years before she arrived. All she had to do was introduce a fire and let the stone remember it. There's a particular kind of intelligence that does not appear in formal education and is not measured by any credential of the period, or, if we are being precise, of this period either. It is the intelligence of close observation applied to real conditions, iterated through necessity and validated by survival. The frontier produced this kind of intelligence in abundance, because the frontier did not accept theoretical answers to physical problems. If the fire went out at midnight and the children were cold by 3 in the morning, the theory was wrong regardless of how well it had been explained. Cora Aldine had that intelligence, and what she understood, what she demonstrated concretely in measurable degrees Fahrenheit and cords of unburned wood, was a set of physical principles that remain as true today as they were in 1871. Thermal mass stores energy. A heavy, dense material, stone, brick, rammed earth, concrete, absorbs heat slowly during a fire and releases it slowly after the fire dies. This is not a marginal effect. In Cora's cave house, it was the difference between needing a fire every 4 hours through the night and needing a fire once in the evening. The same principle underlies the Russian masonry heater, the Korean ondol floor system, the Pueblo adobe wall, and the Finnish soapstone stove, engineering traditions that developed independently on different continents, across different centuries, all arriving at the same conclusion. Burn hot and short, store in mass, release slowly. Position of a heat source determines efficiency. Placing a fire near the exterior of a structure means heating the cold zone first, warming air that immediately migrates toward the cold wall and escapes. Placing the fire deep, surrounded by mass, means the heat radiates outward in all directions through material that holds it. The geometry of Cora's firebox, 22 feet into the cave, with limestone on 4 sides, was not accidental. It was the result of watching how heat moved and asking, with the directness of someone who could not afford to be wrong, where it needed to go. Dead air insulates. The 16-inch gap between Cora's 2 entrance walls was not an architectural flourish. Still air is one of the most effective thermal insulators in nature. It is the principle behind double-pane windows, down insulation, and the layered clothing systems used by every cold-weather culture that survived long enough to develop a textile tradition. By trapping a column of still air between 2 stone walls at the one point where cold most easily entered the space, Cora created an insulating barrier at the weakest point in her design. Modern building science has given this a name, the thermal break, but the principle needed no name to be functional. Draft control is heat control. A fire with too much draft loses heat up the chimney faster than the room can absorb it. A fire with too little draft fills the space with smoke. Cora's diagonal rear vent, threading through a natural crack in the limestone at a low angle, produced a balanced draw that kept combustion clean without exhausting the warm air the stone had worked to store. It was, in modern terms, a low-velocity exhaust, a concept that high-efficiency wood stove designers spent much of the 20th century trying to engineer in metal and ceramic. She did it in stone, by hand, in 1871, because the alternative was a cold winter with cold children and not enough wood. The cave house on the North Ridge of Western Virginia did not survive into the 20th century. Limestone formations are patient, but cave mouths eventually close. A section of upper wall collapsed sometime in the 1890s, according to a brief note in a county land record, and the structure was not rebuilt. Retta Aldine, who married and moved to the Shenandoah Valley in 1882, was interviewed by a local historian in 1921, by which point she was in her late 50s, and described the cave house from memory with the particular clarity of someone recounting a place where they had been warm when warmth was not guaranteed. She remembered the sound of the stone floor underfoot. She remembered the way the fire at the back of the cave threw long shadows on the walls and made the whole space feel, she said, like being inside the mountain's own warmth. She remembered waking in the morning to air that was still breathable, still soft, still carrying the ghost of the previous evening's fire. While outside, her mother told her, the ice was an inch thick on the water bucket. She remembered her mother's hands, calloused, precise, patient, laying each stone flat and tight, not because it looked well, but because it needed to work. That is the thing about the engineering of necessity. It does not aim at elegance. It aims at function. And when it achieves function, when it keeps the children warm, when the woodpile outlasts the winter, when the stone holds its heat through the long, dark hours before dawn, it becomes something that transcends the individual who built it. It becomes knowledge, and knowledge, properly passed, does not expire. What Cora Aldine understood about heat and stone and the geometry of cold is not obsolete. It is not a museum piece. In an era when energy costs are climbing and off-grid living is no longer a frontier necessity, but a deliberate choice for a growing number of people, the principles she applied by observation and need are as actionable today as they were in 1871. Thermal mass, rear-positioned heat sources, buffer zones at cold entry points, slow, balanced exhaust, dense, dry stone as a living radiator. These are not folk techniques waiting to be replaced by something better. In many cases, they're the something better, still ahead of the assumptions built into standard construction in most of the modern world. Cora didn't know she was ahead of anything. She was just trying to keep her family warm. She succeeded. That is the end of Cora Aldine's story, but we want to hear yours. Leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from and what the coldest winter you have ever personally faced was. How did you manage it? What did you learn that no one had taught you? The best survival knowledge in the world lives in the comment sections of people who actually lived through something. If this story gave you something, a principle, an idea, a piece of history you didn't know existed, hit the like button and share it with someone who cares about how things actually work. And if you haven't subscribed yet, every week on this channel, we bring you one technique, one story, one piece of real frontier engineering that passed the only test that ever mattered. It kept people alive. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. We'll see you there. Educational note. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. Characters, names, and specific events are fictional, while the techniques, concepts, and principles discussed are based on real historical practices and well-established physical or practical knowledge. Any modern application should be evaluated according to current standards, safety guidelines, and applicable laws or regulations. This content is educational in nature and does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.